Lynn awoke uncomfortable and confused. She battled to open her eyelids for what seemed like an age, but in reality was probably only a few seconds. Her addled mind found the familiar sight of her bedroom ceiling, comforting an image of the nightmare that had roused her was still in the forefront of her mind. She'd felt she was suffocating, which had always been a particular fear of hers. Once she managed to not only open both eyes but keep them open for more than a second, she noticed the trigger for her nightmare. John was lying asleep on top of her. His left breast to hers meant she wasn't bearing the full brunt of his weight. His hips between her still wide-stretched legs meant it was enough to restrict her breathing automatically. She shoved him sideways. He rolled onto his back and immediately began snoring. She tried to recall what had roused her from deep slumber. The nightmare alone, wasn't it? Still not fully conscious. Her mind wandered back on the pretense of putting the final touches to the contract they'd worked on together for months. John and Lynn had left the office before lunch and come to her place for a nooner. Maybe it wasn't the best idea to share a bottle of wine before the important signing this evening, but she'd bought it specially and it complemented the food she'd bought perfectly. Why not celebrate in style? This contract was the biggest in the history of the company. The fact she'd been chosen to complete it meant she was on a fast-track career as a company favorite. She also wanted to celebrate a change in her personal dynamics, a change she looked forward to immensely that dragged her mind back to the man slumbering beside her. She'd fallen into bed with John about 6 weeks before sharing the stress, and long hours with her fellow lawyer and colleague formed a bond that had almost inevitably resulted in the physical affair they were currently engaged in having crossed the line once. Crossing it the dozen or so times since hadn't been a biggie for her, the unusual hours she was keeping. Plus the travel made it so easy. Still a little confused, Lynn tried to recall details of how she'd ended up like this. Her lips curled into a smile as details returned to her with 6 hours to kill and much to celebrate Johan. And she parked in her carport and made out like teenagers with the heat rising. They dragged each other through the internal door to Lynn's lounge, ripping each other's clothes off as they went. Once they were both naked, Lynn forced John onto his back on the huge sheepskin in front of the fireplace, going to the fridge. She returned with food. Wine and glasses. She straddled him, but didn't allow entry every time he made to sit up and push her onto her back. She pressed him down lovingly. She fed him tidbits from her organized picnic. She cracked the bottle of red and poured 2 glasses, not being able to lift the glass to his lips from his helpless position. Lynn took a long draught from John's glass, held it in her mouth, then transferred it to John's via a deep kiss. Ah. This is the life, Lynn recalled, thinking. Nice food, nice wine, and the anticipation of great intimacy to come. How could it be better in the here and now? Lynn wondered how much wine she'd drunk with effort. She thought back alternating mouthfuls for her, then ones for John. They damned near finished the bottle that probably accounted for the metallic taste coating the inside of her dry mouth with a hunger for food. Satisfied, Lynn recalled retaining the last swallow of her second glass in her mouth, knowing she had only a few moments of his helplessness. Left, Lynn reached over and took a mouthful of John's glass. Things became a little blurry after that, memories of John pushing her off him, reaching down to sling her over his shoulder, and the heavenly trip up the stairs. She distinctly remembered him throwing her on the bed before doing the deed. Then what? Lynn, still groggy, was confused not only by the lack of memory, but by the failure of the just recalled memory to excite her more than they were. A few seconds concentration solved that last mystery. Her bladder was giving out urgent signals, very urgent. With a supreme effort of will she cast her grogginess aside, rolled off the bed, and staggered to the bathroom. She sat and relieved herself. The sheer length of time it took gave her time to notice outside inputs. More weak light was spilling through the frost-edged glass of the bathroom window. The dawn chorus of twittering birds automatically triggers happy memories from a comfortable and contented life. Damn dawn chorus. Not even pausing to wipe herself, Lynn launched into the bedroom and looked desperately at the bedside clock. 7:46. Shone malevolently back at her. Her subconsciousness desperately tried to lie to her and make her believe it was still light. At 7:46 p.m., at that time of year, it failed. The last shreds of lethargy and delusion were swept away by a terrible realization. It had been nearly 17 hours since she and John were supposed to sign the most monumental deal in their company's history. and somehow, they had both slept through it. A chill paralyzed Lynn for a few seconds, as she felt the foundation of her perfect world crumble beneath her. Her immediate instinct was to get to work as quickly as possible and salvage whatever she could. Taking the final few steps to the bed, Lynn shook John's shoulders violently until his eyes slowly fluttered open, still groggy. "Get up, you stupid jerk! We slept through the night. It's almost 8 and our jobs are toast." Lynn impatiently watched as John, in a matter of seconds, went from dazed to horrified. He jumped out of bed, staggered, and hurried downstairs to grab his clothes. Lynn followed, nearly pushing him down the stairs in her urgency. She knew that continuing to berate him would only slow him down, so she settled for giving him dirty looks as he quickly dressed, even skipping the time it would take to put on her bra and just throwing on her discarded blouse and panties. John was fully dressed before her. She had just picked up her pants when she noticed the front door partially open, held only by the safety chain. Vague recollections of the door opening and rattling against the chain came to her, the sound being the source of her earlier awakening. Still staring at the cracked door, a shadow moved against it. Something long whistled through the crack, striking the chain. The screws flew from the mounting bracket, the latch swung through its arc, and the glass pane above shattered before the door crashed open completely. Standing there was a woman who could only be described as anger incarnate. A little over 5 feet tall but nearly as wide, the woman was of Mediterranean descent, an axe dangling from one meaty arm. Her eyes blazed as she glared around the room, finally settling on the seated man and half-naked woman. Lynn heard a startled, "Oh, hell," as Maria gasped. "You little jerk, they were right. You've been doing the dirty on me while I've been out of town nursing Mom." The furious woman's words became a blur, lost on Lynn as she saw the axe raised and Maria taking a step towards them. Lynn instinctively made for the stairs, hindered only by the fact that one leg was still stuck in her pants. Halfway up, John pushed her the rest of the way, racing up the stairs with great urgency. Together, they made a break for the only refuge available, the master bedroom. They heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, followed by the crash of an axe splitting the door. The flimsy barrier shuddered, showing it wouldn't hold for much longer. Lynn retreated to the balcony door, throwing it open. Her brief internal debate on whether to make the 3-meter drop ended as the tip of the axe finally pierced the wooden door. The sight of John barreling toward her pushed her into action. She knew she didn't want to face whatever was coming alone. Turning around, she grabbed the balcony rail, hoisted herself over, and lowered herself to her full stretch before letting go. She landed heavily on her feet but collapsed on her back, winded. John followed, similarly leaping over the balcony. His ankle rolled awkwardly as he landed, and he yelped in pain. With her heart set on escape, Lynn took off, instinctively heading for the carport. She had just gotten her car door open when she noticed a strange car blocking hers. She grabbed her handbag from the front seat and was just about to enter when John hobbled over, asking, "Where's my car?" Lynn didn't have time to explain. "We don't have time for this," she said, speeding over to the strange car. As she glanced around, she saw the 4 flat tires on her car, and her confusion grew. Peering inside the strange car, she saw one good thing, the keys dangling from the ignition, and one bad thing, it had a manual transmission. She had never bothered learning how to drive one. Her options flashed through her mind, but the sound of an approaching angry behemoth cut her thoughts short. "You drive, John. I can't," she said. But John replied, "My ankle is busted. You'll have to." There was no time for further debate. Lynn jumped into the driver's seat, and John hobbled around to the passenger side. She started the engine just fine, and then asked what to do next. JN looked at her terrified and confused until realization dawned. He told her to press the pedal on the left, then rammed it into reverse himself. Somehow the car avoided stalling as Lynn released the clutch and hit the accelerator as they shot backward out of the drive. A swinging axe put a large divot in the windscreen right in front of John Lynn. Backed up the street until the armed woman chasing them gave up with the luxury of time, John coached Lynn through turning around. This included Lynn stalling twice. Lynn thought their first priority was to get to their work as quickly as possible to salvage the contract that had been put in jeopardy by their sleep. And she was annoyed that after the adrenaline of the past 5 minutes had started to fade, All John could do was complain about his sore ankle, then slump into semi-consciousness, rousing only when Lynn forced him to answer questions. "I take it that was your wife." "Uh-huh," John replied. "How did she get the front door of my house open? It was deadlocked and everything. Thank the safety chain was on, or she would have caught us fully in flagrant decto." That didn't require a response, so didn't get one just before they got to their destination, the engine alternately whining with over-revs or shuddering due to being in too high a gear. John roused Lynn. "Where was my car? I did drive it to your place yesterday, didn't I?" Lynn didn't respond. She was still a little disoriented by the law of a big whack of time, then being awoken this morning at a time she didn't expect, and in a very stressful manner. Well, that threw her. She was only half listening to John's next words. "Can we stop for a coffee or something? My mouth feels like it's had a hamster sleeping in it." How much did we drink yesterday that brought to mind the taste Lynn still had in her mouth? She ran her tongue over her palate. There it was, a sharp, metallic taste. It tugged at her memory banks. She was distracted from those thoughts firstly by John's snore, and then their arrival at their place of business. She elbowed him awake, and they headed for the office outside the door. Lynn looked at John's disheveled state, then became aware of her own unfettered breasts. She could only imagine how she looked. "Let's go into the bathrooms and clean up a bit. Meet me in my office. Then we'll go and see Mr. Biggs." Neither took any notice of the receptionist picking up the phone as they headed for the stairs. They were each heading for the bathroom on their floor when they heard their names called. Mr. Biggs. The managing partner was standing outside his office door. They couldn't ignore his crooked finger, gesturing them both to enter his office, preceding them in. He closed the door firmly, then walked behind his desk, glaring at them. The whole time, Lynn saw herself reflected in John's unkempt hair, rumpled clothes, and haggard looks. Finally, Mr. Biggs broke the silence. "Care to give me some explanation on why I spent all last night and this morning trying to salvage a contract after you stood up our client? Why I couldn't get either of you bozos on the phone when they rang me at 6 last night?" Lynn ran various responses quickly through her mind. This was not good. It could put her career back a couple of years. This allowed a still groggy John to answer the uncomfortable questions. "Sorry, boss." We slept in. This response, coupled with their appearance, including Lynn's smeared makeup and improperly buttoned blouse, told Mr. Biggs all he needed to know in all his career. He'd never seen two such talented rising stars commit professional suicide quite so effectively. He paused as a plan formed in his mind. Maybe he could salvage the contract, but only if he offered the clients a couple of heads on a platter. "You two are suspended pending an investigation into your behavior. I suggest that you clean out your desks now. It may save you time later and save me the need to lay eyes on your stupid faces ever again." Lynn and John both bowed their heads in shame. John turned for the door first, followed by Lynn. Mr. Biggs' next words were so soft she almost missed them. "This will devastate your husband, Lynn, whenever we play golf together. It's always Lynn did this, or Lynn said that. I don't know how I'll be able to face him after this." That almost made Lynn stumble, as she began the walk of shame to her office just outside the door. They were intercepted by the assets manager. "John, where were you last night? Where is your company car?" John shook his head. "This is serious. Did you drive your car last night?" "I don't think so. I went to sleep yesterday afternoon and didn't wake up until this morning. My car was missing." "Did you report it stolen to the police?" he asked. John just shook his head again. "Well, if I were you, I would call the police immediately. They called this morning to check who was assigned to that car. Apparently, whoever stole it from your place used it to ram raid the local biker hangout. 2 of their guys were injured when the car crashed through the wall of their clubhouse. You might want to come up with a more convincing alibi before you call them." John turned to look at Lynn in utter confusion. She had no answers for him. Lynn and John hobbled to their respective offices, collecting their personal effects in file boxes. As they left, they had to endure the humiliation of the admin manager going through the boxes to ensure no company equipment or data was being taken. Their colleagues stood silently, witnesses to the scene, as they were escorted to the door. They placed the boxes in the back of John's wife's car. Lynn pushed John away when he tried to offer a comforting hug. All that had happened in the last hour was because he hadn't woken them up yesterday afternoon. Still stunned, They both sat in the front seat of the car. John was driving, and Lynn glanced at herself for the first time that day. Then, she looked at John and saw them as their boss likely saw them. Bloody stupid. John finally broke the silence, proving he was back in reality. Job and marriage, both toasted in one day? Wow. Lynn was about to snap at him for his insensitive and unhelpful comment when the screech of tires caught their attention. John gasped as he looked toward the car park entrance. "Damn, Carlos!" John quickly started the car and gasped in pain as his injured ankle pressed the clutch pedal. They took off, heading out the entrance, and passed John's wife in the passenger seat of a strange car. The driver was big and angry, glaring at them as they drove by. "Who the hell is Carlos?" asked Lynn. "My wife's brother. He's bad news. Mob bad. He spent more time in jail than out, and he's never liked me. His first stint was because he beat up some guy at school for saying Maria was easy behind her back. Now you tell me, you clown," Lynn replied as John sped away. She was relieved to see the other car getting boxed in while attempting a U-turn. Lynn directed John to make a couple of quick turns. Once they were out of sight, 5 minutes later, they saw no sign of pursuit, and they were on one of the freeways through the city. They debated where to go, but couldn't reach a decision. John's house was out of the question, and now that they knew Maria was aware of where Lynn lived, her place was off the list too. They were no closer to deciding when John reached for the dashboard and turned on a device. "It's my wife's habit to listen to the police radio channel," John explained. "It's legal unless someone uses the information they hear." The airwaves were busy, giving the license plate number and description of the car they were in. It had been reported stolen and was linked to the ram raid the previous night. Before they could process this, they saw flashing lights off to the side and heard sirens wailing. Lynn turned to see a motorcycle policeman alongside them, gesturing for them to pull over. She told John to obey. The motorcycle pulled in right in front of them, and the rider dismounted, slowly removing his helmet before walking toward them. He looked at the broken windshield, and the pair sat silently as the policeman leaned in through John's window. To their surprise, he asked if they knew it was illegal to drive with the windshield in that condition. With relief, they realized he hadn't heard the recent bulletins. John gave his name and address since he couldn't produce a license. They held their breath as the officer returned to his bike, retrieved an iPad-like device, and began tapping away. He looked back at them with a long arm, just as the sound of loud, decelerating Harleys reached their ears. They were going the opposite way, about 10 of them, the last few turning their heads toward Lynn and John as they passed. The rest of the bikers were slowing down, searching for a gap in the railing to cross the median strip. John reacted automatically. He started the car, shoved it into gear, and took off. His plan, if it could even be called that, was to pass the motorcycle officer on the inside and accelerate along the shoulder. He had the speed to pull into the traffic. He was so intent on looking in the wing mirror that he missed the policeman's reflex action hearing the car start behind him. The policeman stepped away from the bike and the road. Lynn's yell came too late to stop him from hitting the guy with the offside wing. Stopping wasn't an option, so John continued to accelerate in her mirror. Lynn watched in horror as the policeman tried to roll onto his feet, an impossible task, with his legs sticking out at such an unnatural angle. Lynn vented her spleen at her chauffeur. John, trying to ignore her, just pulled into. The flow of cars then wove in and out of the traffic at well above the posted speed with no sign of pursuit. John took the second next exit and headed away from the freeway on increasingly minor roads. They both cringed whenever they saw a motorcycle 5 minutes later. Later, they spotted a shopping center car park and pulled in to let the aftermath of the adrenaline rush wash over them. Lynn kept up a steady stream of abuse at both John's judgment and driving skills. He closed his eyes and tried to blot her out. He vaguely wondered which of his pursuers he should worry about the most. The police would lock him up and destroy what was left of his career. If he was lucky, the bikers would just beat him up. Maybe even him. No, they were wimps. The real threat was Carlos. If he almost killed the kid in school because he badmouthed his sister. How much trouble was John in to distract himself? He rooted through his wife's glove box until he found an old Leatherman tool after explaining his plan to Lynn. She stood guard while he removed the license plates from the car next to theirs. He put them in their car. Then, as an afterthought, put their old ones on the other car. It was less conspicuous than leaving it bare. They had to buy time until they decided what to do. They then took off on the road leading further out of town, pulling into a secluded spot along a river, exhausted and tired. They laid the seats back and rested as an afterthought. John suggested Lynn turn her phone off to prevent it from being tracked. "What the hell do we do now?" John buggered. "If I know Lynn, I've got no phone, no wallet, and no money. If I turn up back at my place before she's had a chance to settle down, I'm toast. The same goes if I turn up at any of my family's places. I suspect, what about your place? They're probably watching it, but we could sneak in. Surely your husband will look after us, won't he?" I don't know if we'll get much of a welcome there," Lynn replied. "Why not? You said he knew about us and was cool with it." "I may have lied a little about that. Yes, he did know about us, but I may have exaggerated about how well he took it, so you could relax." "So you mean I have to watch out for an angry husband as well as everyone else?" "Jesus, no. He's not like that. He hasn't a malicious bone in his body and wouldn't hurt a fly. He's a pharmacist, and I think they take the same oath as doctors, not to hurt anyone." "So he didn't take the news?" "Well then, ask John." "No, he confronted me last week, knew your name, and everything, gave me an ultimatum. Me like an arrogant woman, though I told him to get lost. I wanted everything, a career that was going, places, a nice house and car, comfortable husband and family. I told him I demanded to have a lover that filled me up as well. If he couldn't live with it, I would get one of the partners as my divorce lawyer. He'd end up living in a shoebox, begging me to see the kids every month or so. I was bluffing, but he didn't know that he lives for those kids. I half expected him to call my bluff, but he just stormed out. I haven't seen him since the next day. I dropped the kids off at my parents' and met you at that motel last Monday. You remember?" Despite everything they'd been through that day, John was horrified to be sharing a car and a nightmare with the creature Lynn revealed herself to be. It took minutes for the speechlessness to wear off, so you gave him a choice. Put up with you messing around on him or lose everything. Why not? The law says I can get away with it, so why wouldn't I? Why look so shocked? Weren't you messing around on your wife as well?" "Yes, I was. I didn't insist on ripping it off to do it. Pardon the pun," John replied. Lynn shrugged. John, seeing her in a new light, realized with his blinkers off that the smile he'd once found so sensuous now had a hard edge to it. He couldn't imagine the cruelty she had just described, all while appearing to have a clear conscience. Lynn, on the other hand, wondered where she could get a drink, still tasting that damn metallic flavor in her mouth. She joined John in dozing until hunger woke her in the late afternoon. She roused before him and turned on her phone to send a quick text to her mother, asking her to look after the kids indefinitely. God only knew what her parents were being told. When John woke, they pondered the mysteries of the last few days, avoiding the difficult questions. What would they do next? Not showing up for a contract signing after obviously sleeping together had cost them their jobs. What had made them sleep for a solid 17 hours? And how had John's wife known where to find him and how to open the front door? They knew that if it weren't for the safety chain, they both would have had their skulls crushed in. They had seen the look in Maria's eyes. They were stuck on these questions when Lynn noticed Carlos's car cruising slowly down the road through the trees. It kept going, though, and as soon as it disappeared around a corner, they headed the other way. John was furious when he found out Lynn had turned her phone on earlier. He reached over to grab it and throw it out the window, but she protected it. He turned it off again, and they quickly headed in a completely different direction. Not that it mattered. They had no destination in mind. It was 2 hours before dusk when they passed a remote fuel stop about 200 kilometers from home. John glanced at the fuel gauge, took a risk, and pulled in. While he fueled up at the automatic pump, Lynn went inside to use the facilities and then grabbed some food. At the counter, she tried to pay with her debit card, but it was declined twice. She checked her cash while the attendant tried her credit card, which was declined as well. Just then, the attendant looked over her shoulder and asked what her husband was waving at. Lynn turned to see John gesturing to her furiously. She sprinted from the office, ignoring the shop assistant yelling about the food she still held in her hands. John babbled about two bikers who had just shown up, one of whom had immediately pulled out his phone. Lynn ordered John to get in, and they sped off. She glanced in the mirror as the bikers gave chase. She didn't think it was the right time to tell him that the police had canceled her cards to prevent them from being used. They had only made it a couple of kilometers when the sound of revving motorcycles reached their ears over their own screaming engine. One bike was in each of their rear quarters. John swerved into the middle of the road as they went around a corner. When they hit a straight stretch, the bike on their left surged forward to overtake. Reflexively, John edged left, which allowed the biker on the right to seize the opportunity. The biker was level with the rear door when John saw him in the mirror. Purely by instinct, he swerved the wheel to the right, not hitting the bike, but forcing it off the side of the road. Lynn watched in fascination as the bike went into the drainage ditch, catapulting the rider off. She saw his companion slow down and turn to help him. John, adrenaline high, asked Lynn if she had seen what was on the cyclists' jackets. When she said it showed a man in a Mexican-style sombrero, John groaned and explained that they were part of the Bandidos, a violent motorcycle club. Both the rider and passenger anxiously watched the fuel gauge. John had only just started fueling when the bikers arrived, right as dusk fell, and the fuel gauge was already nearing empty. John pulled off into a quiet country lane and killed the engine. In the last light of day, they saw some farms and outbuildings a few hundred meters away. On a stand, there was a 10,000-liter tank with a hose and nozzle. John checked the fuel nozzle. It wasn't locked, and liquid came out when the trigger was pressed. He quickly scanned the area, but there were no containers nearby. Unsure whether to turn on his phone to use the flashlight function, concerned about being traced, he decided to keep moving. Returning to the car, John and Lynn hunkered down to wait. The plan was to wait until midnight, push the car to the pump, fuel up, and keep running. While passing the time, they talked about the strange events of the last day, listing the people who might be after them. First, they'd fallen asleep while making love on Lynn's bed. A detail in itself not strange, but everything else certainly was. But sleeping for 17+ hours was unconsciously Lynn grabbed the remains of the packet of potato chips she'd shoplifted from the roadhouse. Maybe they would remove the lingering taste from her mouth, much of what happened since they woke that morning. Or was it a week ago? Was caused by John's car apparently being used to ram raid the local biker hangout. Obviously, it had been stolen and given time. JN could have convinced the bikers of that. That was all a little academic now, after they'd injured one. Or worse, escaped from the roadhouse. Through the slightly optimistic eyes of those in these types of situations, they reviewed the motivations and intentions of those arrayed against them. Johann thought that his wife and brother-in-law would be satisfied by a light beating, followed by a rapid wife-centric divorce agreement. The police? What did they know? Only that he'd knocked over and inured an officer and failed to stop. The failure to stop was justifiable. Given the bikers, would the injury result in jail time? They both considered it a small possibility. It was a justifiable accident. After all, that left only the bikers. John suggested that their reputation had been exaggerated by the media, and they weren't actually as bad as everyone made out. Lynn cashed that optimistic line of reasoning. Her husband used to be in a biker club. He described a culture of crime that was an accepted way of life, and violence was endemic. Her husband's office in the club was in charge of stealing cars, either for sale or for use in their various nefarious activities. It became obvious to JN that due to Lynn's memories of those stories, she was very, very afraid of the bikers. She went on to describe how her husband had escaped from the criminal life, got a straight job, and worked his way through university. It was obvious that Lynn was quite proud of her pharmacist. The car went quiet, and silence reigned until the lights went out. In the farmhouse between John and Lynn, they pushed the car with difficulty over to the Bowser, nervous and panting. John opened the fuel cap on the car and started filling it. It gurgled nicely into the tank until it overflowed. Hobbling back to the driver's side, he got in, started the engine, then floored it so the farmer wouldn't glimpse them and pass on a description. They just made it to the farm gate, about 50 meters. When the car hesitated, 20 meters later, all the lights on the dash went on as the engine stopped. Looking out the back window, Lynn urged John to get it restarted. Despite continuous cranking, it refused. A horrible thought occurred to Lynn. Is this car petrol or diesel? Petrol needs 98 octane, I think. And what was in that Browser? Most farm equipment runs on diesel, doesn't it? How the hell should I know I'm a city boy? John replied. They both began yelling at each other and still were, when John's door was wrenched open, and the farmer dragged him out. Pressing him to the side of the car, he demanded loudly to be told what the hell was going on. Lynn used the opportunity to jump out. The car was in a gateway way, and there was no room to get between them, so she was forced to go around the back, then along the driver's side as she passed the struggling pair. She saw a short length of a tree limb about 75 millimeters thick and 900 millimeters long. It was bad enough being on the run. The thought of being on the run alone was terrifying. With only a second's hesitation, Lynn picked up the log, and with no style whacked the farmer over the back of the head. He went down like a sack of spuds, wide-eyed. They stared at each other. Then John hobbled after Lynn as she fled toward the highway, using her impromptu club as a walking stick. They didn't hesitate when they reached it. Just started walking in the direction they'd been going all day, towards nothing, away from everything they knew. They threw themselves off the road every time a car came along. 2 hours later, they passed a sign saying the next town was still 10 kilometers ahead. They were both mentally and physically exhausted. John's ankle hurt like hell, and Lynn was starting to get blisters spotting a lone barn. They forced way through the fence and made for it. There was enough hay in it to provide an adequate bed. They both fell into a troubled sleep day. 2. Lynn woke, way before dawn, still tired, hungry, and thirsty. She was a little confused, not realizing where she was. The metallic taste still in her mouth brought the unpleasant memories of the previous day crashing back strangely. Her first coherent thought was of her children, her recent entitled selfish mantle. Aside, Lynn loved her children if she could avoid being killed or thrown in jail. She would go home, hug her children like never before, and wait for her husband to come growling back to her with time. Things could go back to normal, delusions, all of them. But believed by a famished, thirsty, exhausted, and desperate mind, how much trouble was she in? Lynn asked herself. John's wife and her mob brother were after JN. If she could get to the police, they would protect her. It was John's car that had been used in the ram raid, and John, who had knocked the biker over, knew that they were after him, not her. Once again, the police could protect her from them, but that left only the police to worry about. What had she really done wrong? She had taken some things from a roadhouse without paying, hardly a crime that warranted jail time. But then she had assaulted a farmer, which was serious for sure. The real question was, how did the world know it was her who did it? The solution to her problems suddenly became clear. If she left John sleeping and got to the nearest police station first, she could lay all the blame on him, even claiming that he had been the one to assault the farmer. Once she turned him in, all she could expect was a slap on the wrist. The world would forget about her, and she could quietly sneak back home. Lynn examined her conscience, considering this plan. Could she really do that to her lover? Like many relationships born out of cheating, she realized theirs was doomed from the start. John was just a temporary distraction when she needed one, and besides, he was a cheater. She would never trust him enough to have a long-term relationship. Lynn smiled to herself and prepared to slip away from the barn, but a faint rustling noise caught her attention. In the moonlight, she saw John quietly pick up his shoes and head out of the barn. Instinctively, Lynn knew what was happening. After his own internal debate, John had decided to stop her. Enraged, Lynn sprang to her feet, grabbed her walking stick, and brought it down on John's head. He collapsed, staying down. Removing his shoes, she threw them into the darkness, one in each direction. Her plan had to be modified. Now, she would claim self-defense when it came time to explain the situation to the police. Jaw set, Lynn strode toward town. At an unknown time later, Lynn briefly turned on her phone to check the time and distance to town. She was almost done when the phone began changing screens on its own. In a panic, she realized it was being controlled remotely. Only one person could do that, the person whose phone it was paired with. Why would her husband be trying to find her? No, she thought. The police must have insisted he give them his phone. Lynn quickly removed the battery and continued toward town, her ears alert for the sound of approaching traffic in the pre-dawn darkness. As she walked, she plotted her next moves. She would accept a slap on the wrist, then demand her husband come back home. If he played up, she would use her secret fund, money siphoned from her salary into a separate bank account, to divorce him. Not working and not in a hurry to get another job, she would demand maximum child support while making it impossible for him to see the kids. After some necessary groveling, she might take him back. But if he objected to her taking a new lover, he would know exactly what was in store for him. Before she was even a third of the way to town, her anger couldn't mask the pain in her feet from the inappropriate footwear. Even her blisters had blisters, but she staggered into town. The police station was halfway down the main street, but a sign on the door indicated it wouldn't be staffed until 9 a.m. She guessed it was around 7, so she sat on the steps to wait. She had no idea how much time passed, but gradually she became aware of a mounting roar. It penetrated her tired, overloaded brain. The sound of motorcycles, many motorcycles. Leaping to her feet, she ran around to the side of the police station and hid in some bushes. Peeking out, she saw pairs of bikers stopping every 50 meters or so down the main street, getting off their bikes and looking around. The door to the station opened, and a uniformed man with sergeant stripes walked to the curb, scanning the street. Without thinking, Lynn jumped up and ran through the open door. The policeman followed her. The sergeant was very interested to hear who she was. When she told them where John had been when she last saw him, he jumped on the radio and briskly gave orders to his unit on patrol. He then made some other calls before interviewing Lynn properly. She was very cooperative, and soon he had a witness statement attesting to 2 assaults by motor vehicle and an assault on the farmer. Partway through, a groggy John was brought in. The sergeant took one look at him and called an ambulance when it arrived, and John was stretchered up and loaded. The bikers closed in, but were kept at bay by the police escort, as the ambulance and escort drove off. Lynn, peering around the doorframe, saw John's brother-in-law sprinting for his car and a ton of bikers. Racing for their rides, things quietened down again, and Lynn finished her statement. She denied knowing anything about how John was injured, with only shoplifting to her name. Lynn was fully charged and told she could go with her part in the serious injury of an officer. The police weren't at all cooperative about letting her use a phone, and her mobile having gone flat, she decided to walk to the nearest payphone to make a call to who she hadn't yet decided. Suddenly all hell broke loose in the station. Gradually Lynn pieced the story together. The ambulance and escort had been hijacked by unidentified bikers and others. Luckily no one resisted, and everyone was unharmed. JN was missing. Lynn sighed now. There was no one to refute her side of the story. She stepped out into the street and saw half a dozen bikers in either direction looking at her. She ran back inside and asked for protective custody. Still in an unforgiving mood, the sergeant laughed and asked for what shoplifting. She was told that as it was public property they couldn't force her to leave until 5 p.m. When they closed, Lynn begged and pleaded, but the sergeant was vindictively adamant just before 5. She checked to see if the bikers were still there. They were. Lynn, sore, hungry, tired and weary beyond belief, felt she had no choice, dropping her chin to her chest. She turned and walked back into the station. 15 minutes later, the sergeant had a confession to 2 serious assaults, and Lynn took residency of a nice safe cell. Lynn's husband put down the phone. The call from his lawyer had told him not to expect his wife home. In the next 5 years or so, it also predicted one of the quickest and most one-sided divorces in history. He glanced toward the tempting bottle of Lafro. He'd been nudging the bottle a little much in the last month or so. Ever since his and Lynn's wedding anniversary, he'd been at work and needed the date for a form. Glancing at the calendar, his heart sank as he realized it was their anniversary. Like the last time he forgot it, he predicted he was going to cop a fogging when he got home. He was just in the middle of arranging to leave early to buy a gift. When Lynn rang, she had to work late that night. She'd obviously forgotten their anniversary as well, which was very out of character for her. Something must really be distracting her. He did leave early, and did buy her a nice necklace, then was home in time to meet the kids from school and make them a healthy dinner. Lynn came home after 9, and he looked at her unemotionally. For once, she avoided coming over for the customary kiss, or even making eye contact with blinkers off. He could see she was freshly showered. The hair on the nape of her neck was still damp. There was no mention of the missed anniversary. He was lucky that she was so busy hiding her own demeanor that she totally failed to spot his unusual one. The rest was easy. He waited for her to work late again, followed her from her office to a restaurant, then a motel, noted her lover's number plate, and then did his research. He had no plan when he confronted her for the sake of the children. He may have forgiven her. If she had shown genuine remorse and convinced him that it would never happen again, her actual reaction would not have been so shocking, appalling, and, most importantly, offensive to him. He left to clear his head, to avoid the risk of hurting her physically. The cheap, commercially available telephone and email bugs provided him with the information he needed to carry out the next step of his plan. The whiskey bottle called to him. Still. Why not? The kids were in bed. It would be harmless. Yet, the thought made him sad. Tomorrow, he'd have to explain to his children that they wouldn't be seeing their mother for a while, unless she found another source of bail money. That was a conversation he wasn't looking forward to. He recalled the paperwork shuffle he had done at work earlier that day. With a bit of luck, and only a cursory audit, the missing sleeping pills would never be noticed. If any of the 6 customers happened to notice the discrepancy and report a missing pill, he'd likely face a minor reprimand. He absent-mindedly picked up his phone and deleted the tracking program, then erased a few contacts that he would never need again. He checked his bank balance online and saw that all their old joint account balances had been transferred to his new account. The amount was consistent with the contents of Lynn's secret account, which he had discovered. Once he had come to terms with the fact that his wife could be deceptive, he had started looking for answers. Her arrogance had been evident when she put the statements in a folder next to the regular accounts, assuming he wouldn't pay attention to the family finances, which had always been her domain. Her password had been predictable. He shook his head. How long had she known him? Did she really think he would ever consider living a life of humiliation, abandoning the pride that formed the cornerstone of his beliefs? She knew he would die for his kids, and that made it all the easier to kill for them. He rubbed his sore knee, remembering the accident. Cheap, bloody Japanese cars. The dashboard shouldn't have collapsed after hitting such a tiny brick wall. He poured himself a generous drink, for medicinal purposes, of course, and pulled out his checklist. He double-checked that everything had been completed, then set it on fire with a lighter and watched it burn in the fireplace. As the paper curled and crumbled, he scoured his mind for any detail he might have missed. Once again, he found nothing left undone. He took another sip and, for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relaxation. That'll do, Dave. That'll do. And so, we reach the end of today's story. Was it what you expected? Or did it take a turn you didn't see coming? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's start a conversation. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here or just haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join our community. I bring you fresh, captivating stories every day, so click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.